Hello and welcome to The Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, I have something a little different for you. I've recently been lucky enough to travel to Tenerife for a week for a holiday, and whilst there got chatting with some people in the hotel bar. The conversation got round to what we all do for a living, and I talked about my regular career and also that I have a true crime YouTube channel. At this point, one of the group opened up about how their life had been affected by crime. It was a fascinating story of both heartbreak and happiness, which led to an emotional discussion that went on late into the night and the early hours of the following morning. The next evening, we talked again, and I asked if he would mind me sharing his story on my channel. He agreed, but on the condition that I change the names of the people involved, as some of those closest to him were unaware of everything that had happened. It is often easier to open up to a complete stranger with no fear of judgment than it is to our nearest and dearest. So here is Pete's story. I hope I do it justice. Pete and his wife Shelley met during Freshers' Week at university and got married several years later. This was sometime in the mid-90s. After a series of miscarriages, followed by a traumatic pregnancy and birth, their son, Ben, was born in January 2000. Pete described Ben as an absolute angel of a baby who would sleep well, eat well, and always seemed to be laughing. After everything that Shelley had been through both physically and mentally, they decided that their family was complete and in their eyes absolutely perfect. Ben was a bright, sociable child who loved football. He was what Pete described as a cheeky little lad, who at times would push his luck with his teachers and football coach and end up being kept back after school or sat out from the team for a match or two. Nevertheless, he was very popular, as he seemed to have a way about him that enabled him to get away with more than many of the other kids his age. As he progressed to secondary school, his happy-go-lucky personality continued. Good grades were only negated by the odd detention and calls for him to please stop chatting in class. He had a wide circle of friends and 3 best mates with whom he was pretty much inseparable. Pete and Shelley would meet up with the other parents every month to compete in the local pub quiz. In the summer of 2016, Ben sat his GCSEs and had plans to stay at school to sit his A-levels before hopefully going to university to study engineering. Life was good for the family until, very suddenly, it wasn't. There had been a spate of burglaries in the small town where they lived, somewhere which was generally considered to be a safe area. It was playing on the mind of many of the residents, with several choosing to purchase the newly launched Ring doorbell to help protect their properties. Ben was making the most of the school summer holidays with his friends and seemed to be at home less and less. His bedroom was a mess, clothes were thrown around everywhere and dirty plates and dishes piled up in the room. At 16, he was responsible for cleaning and tidying his own room, but as he had been working so hard studying for his exams, Shelley decided to spruce it up for him when he was out one day. She gathered up the dirty dishes, changed the bed, dusted and vacuumed. As she was finishing up, her vacuum cleaner caught on something brown under the edge of the bed. Thinking it was one of Ben's belts, Shelley pulled it out from under the bed, only to find that it was a woman's handbag. To her knowledge, Ben didn't have a girlfriend, but she began to wonder what her 16-year-old son had been up to when he was in the house alone. Shelley opened the bag and found a purse, some jewellery, and a large stack of 10 and 20 pound notes. Pete was at work, so Shelley phoned him, unsure as to what to do next. They decided to wait until that evening and talk to Ben about what they had found. At first, Ben was defensive, saying that Shelley had no right to be snooping around in his bedroom, but when his parents quickly shut that argument down, Ben became increasingly upset. He started to cry as he explained that his 3 close friends were the ones responsible for the recent burglaries and how he had begged them not to do it. He said that he had agreed to hide the handbag for them after they promised that they would never do it again. Ben pleaded with his parents not to tell anyone and promised that he himself had nothing to do with the crimes. He said that it was over now and there was nothing to be gained from telling the other boy's parents other than to potentially ruin his lifelong friendships. He pleaded and begged, protesting his innocence until eventually Shelley and Pete reluctantly agreed. Shelley said that she would take the handbag to the local police station and say that she had found it whilst out walking their dog. After a while, life seemed to be getting back to normal for the family. The local burglaries seemed to have stopped, so Shelley and Pete assumed that Ben's friends had stuck to their word and the horrible episode was put behind them. Nevertheless, Pete was still worried. He began to notice changes in Ben's behaviour. He had become more secretive with his phone, spent more and more time in his room, and would often want to pop out with no prior warning because the lads had made some plans. He was moody and defensive, but Shelley was adamant that all of these things were just part of being a teenage boy. Pete couldn't shake his concern, so one day, when Ben was out, Pete searched his bedroom. He found nothing sinister, barring a couple of questionable magazine choices. Pete was so relieved and, in his words, never so happy to have found a stash of porn. But unfortunately, his relief was short-lived. A couple of days later, he was searching for some missing tools. Having looked everywhere in his shed and garage, he decided to look in the old wooden playhouse that the boys had used as their camp in years gone by. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw what was in there. Several shoeboxes containing money, jewellery, watches and trinkets, books that he had never seen before, random items of designer clothing, 6 laptops, framed family photos, and drug paraphernalia. Pete knew that Ben was in far deeper than he had admitted. Pete called Shelley and Ben and asked them both to come home immediately. When he asked Ben about what he had found, rather than his son being sad and begging for forgiveness, he became cocky and aggressive. It was as though he could do whatever he wanted, and there was nothing that his parents could do about it. Ben refused to talk and stormed out of the house. Pete and Shelley were at a loss as to what to do next. They decided that they had no choice but to speak to the parents of the 3 other boys to let them know what was going on with their sons. When they began talking, an even darker picture began to emerge. Ben hadn't been hanging out with the other 3 boys for months. At the beginning of the summer, Ben had become friends with someone by the name of Kevin, a man in his early 20s. Kevin was always getting into trouble with the police and was known to hang around the secondary schools in the area selling drugs to teenagers. Just after Ben and his friends had completed their exams, they bought some marijuana from Kevin. 3 of them immediately regretted it, but Ben enjoyed it and kept wanting to go back for more. Soon after, the other 3 boys distanced themselves from Ben, but did not let their parents know this for fear of them finding out that they had bought marijuana. Ben slipped away, and the other boys said they no longer recognised the person that he had become. They knew that Ben and Kevin had been responsible for the burglaries in the area and that Ben had been using drugs. Pete and Shelley were understandably horrified. They waited for Ben to return that night and confronted him about what they knew. Ben laughed in their faces and said, "So what are you going to do about it?" before storming out of the room. Pete and Shelley knew that they had to do something, but simply did not know what. Ben was their son, their pride and joy, but he had turned into a person who they did not know. For the next few days they barely slept and went around in circles discussing what to do next. The only thing that they agreed upon was that Ben needed help, but how could they help him when Ben did not want to help himself? When he woke on the Thursday morning, Pete suddenly felt clarity as to what needed to be done. He left without waking Shelley. He then walked to the police station and told them everything that he knew. His words to me were that it was the single most desperate and depressing thing that I'd ever have to do. He went on to state that whilst many would never understand his decision, it was based purely on the need to help and save the son who I love so much. The police arrived later that morning to talk to Ben. Pete tried to explain to Shelley why I had decided to tell the police, but she wouldn't listen. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I will never, ever forgive you for this." She then went upstairs, packed her bags and moved out. Ben, who was 16 at the time of his crimes, was ordered to get treatment for his drug dependency and complete various behavioural and educational programs. Pete moved Ben to a different area in the hope of giving Ben a fresh start. By his own admission, he was very hard on the boy, but felt that he had to compensate for Shelley being far too lenient. Ben dropped out of school, and the time that followed was what Pete describes as the darkest days of his life. Ben was angry at his father for reporting him, angry at his mother for leaving, and angry at himself for wrecking his own life. There were many times when Pete believed that either one or both of them wouldn't make it. After months of therapy and patience from Pete eventually paid off when one day Ben came downstairs as Pete was sitting at the kitchen table. Ben put his arms around Pete and simply said, "Thank you for everything, Dad." Since then, Ben joined college and has sat his A-levels, achieving good grades, and whilst a bit later than planned, really hopes to start at university soon. When I saw the two of them interacting together on holiday, I honestly thought what a lovely father-son relationship they had, at first having no idea of what it took to get them there. I asked Pete if he had any regrets about what he had done, and he genuinely believes that his son would either be in prison or dead by now, had he not intervened. His one regret is that Shelley could never come to terms with what he did. The two are no longer in contact, and Pete had to lose the love of his life in order to save his son. I believe that Pete's story is amazing, but am fully aware that there must be others in his position who do not get the happy ending that he so clearly deserved. So it led me to question, at what point would you report a child or any family member to the police? Would you be more likely to turn a blind eye to a minor crime but report a serious one? And if it were a serious crime, could you deal with being the one who potentially put your loved one away for a number of years? Or is there simply nothing that would stop you from protecting your loved one, even if it meant they got away with something sinister? As always, I would be fascinated to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. So there we are. My thanks to open speech marks Pete and his family, close speech marks, for helping me with today's case, and I genuinely enjoyed meeting these people on holiday. Yes, I was going away for a holiday, but I really enjoyed doing this whilst away. If you ever have a story that you think would be of interest to this audience, please let me know and give me loads of details, please. I normally aim for around 1,500 plus words. Email me at thecrimereel@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The video footage used in this video is stock footage, but every now and again there are some of my holiday photos. Cheers and goodbye.